And our program guest this morning to look back over the first 2 months of a hung parliament at the federal level is the government's leader in the House, Anthony Albanese. But first, for more on the Victorian election, we'll bring in the panel now and see what the Sunday papers are saying, and of course we'll focus on the Melbourne papers, and it's all on the election. But we'll just recap first of all on the situation. Labor needs to stay in front in 6 seats where they lead, and they lead just 18 votes in one case is the lead, 110 votes in another case. Then they need to get in front in a seat where they now trail, and that is Bentley, and they trail by 600 votes. All of that just to draw, George.
Just a draw, which means they can't form government, because after the appointment of a Speaker, they've only got 43 votes on the floor. The best thing John Brumby can hope for is another election sometime early in January or February, and I think his not concession speech last night was the beginning of a campaign pitch for a second chance. I think the tactical error last night was not to admit that the electorate had not only given them a kicking, but it actually kicked them out of office because they can't form government on the numbers last night.
Though he did say, Andrew, that we're here, we get the message.
He did say that, but he didn't say what the message was. And then he started his campaign speech for the next election, which was essentially a rerun of all he'd said before. Now, I know it's very hard to suddenly propose a whole new agenda on the election night for the next election to be called if there's a draw. But the thing is, I think John Brumby has lost. Even a draw means he's lost. Because if there's a draw and they go to another election, his authority is gone. What's he going to do now? I mean, I just think it's all over. The only issue is whether we're going to get there to a coalition government with a new election in between.
Yeah, tied result in this circumstance isn't quite as gripping as the tied result on the federal level. I mean, it's kind of, it's a game without punch when you don't have any independents to negotiate with. I mean, short of any disaffected backbencher from either side agreeing to put up their hand and be a speaker, which seems kind of completely unlikely, then...
well, you raise a very good point about there being no independence. I think that's one of the few takeouts for the federal thing, that what this election did was wipe out all independents, didn't give a seat to the Greens. It's really coalesced between the two major parties plus the Nationals.
It's amazing, isn't it, to see a swing go so cleanly from a government to the coalition.
Well, people looked at Canberra, I think. This is what Craig Ingram told me last night, the one independent left who lost his seat in his Gippsland back to the Nationals. He said people looked at Canberra, at the shenanigans there with the independents, and didn't want it.
But what's the message? I mean, like, because Brumby says, we've heard the message, and the message is clear up to a point. It's, we're kind of over you, and we want you to, it's becoming a bit of a pattern, isn't it?
Well, as locals, Andrew, we could probably pick any number of service delivery issues that would have kicked this government.
Look, just before you go on that question of service deliveries, Gavin Jennings, one of the Brumby government ministers, went to that point last night. Let's hear from him.
There's cumulative baggage that any government assumes in keeping up with communities' expectations, giving the infrastructure and service delivery that people want. When you actually consider that our public transport system now has 4 million passengers a year, which is twice what it had a decade ago, there are real stresses and strains that come on the delivery and the timeliness of that delivery.
It's not easy.
No, but look, there are so many authors of this defeat, and that is service delivery. Waste was a huge one, and also tiredness, of course. Another factor, George, that I think this election was held in the wettest October in 35 years. It rained even on election day.
And the turnout was low.
But it wasn't just the turnout was low. As Gavin Jennings told me later after that interview, what that actually happened too was focus people's attention on one symbol of this waste, which was the desalination plant. That now looks like costing us $1 million a day to run, even if we don't need the water, because the rains have lifted. That alone, I wonder whether this is the first election decided by the weather.
It does seem, though, like at the state level the brands aren't as important as they are at the federal level, and it just takes a single issue to annoy somebody, whether it be violence, whether it be transport or whatever, and it makes the difference. It only needs one issue that really matters to somebody.
The interesting thing here is the Labor Party people have been telling them for a couple of years now public transport's a big issue, and their comeback was only 7% of voters use public transport in Victoria, which was, cutting and dicing it via the data cube to try and work out whether you can avoid this argument. Anyone who's caught a train in Victoria or anyone who's caught a tram in Victoria knows the last few years the thing's gone nuts.
But also
standing room only. But the thing is, what Victoria hasn't been able to get right is probably the best run state in the country, which is one of the reasons for the denial in the Brumby camp at the moment. Population growth over the odds for the last few budgets, but they haven't been able to provide any backup for it. So people are coming in, but they don't know what to do with it.
That argument, George, you're absolutely right that they have been coasting on this idea that we're the competent managers, right? And we've had this growth. Yeah. But when you pass it back, the growth is largely through population growth. Yep. And when you look at the figures for growth in income per head of population, we're nearly down to basket case levels of New South Wales. And we're the second worst in the country. And people have looked at the growth but not felt it themselves that they're benefiting. And I think that's added to that sourness.
And another important issue, Annabelle, the Liberals put the Greens last. Now, in my view, that was a brilliant tactical move, and maybe not a tactical move, a move on principle that I think won the respect of the party in a lot of those outer suburbs.
Well, I think in the days, it was really funny, in the hours after the Liberal Party finally announced that decision, there was all this chat about, oh, what does this mean? It's an incredibly beady-eyed, sort of Knight's jump move. And maybe sometimes a cigar is just a cigar in these circumstances.
Exactly.
It's a decision that was made because it was an obvious and appropriate decision for that party to make. And this is sort of the funny thing that I think the major parties miss. Sometimes with the Greens, they get very spooked about, well, they're this sort of encroaching threat to us. And the attraction for the Greens often is that voters are so annoyed with each side of politics because of the lack of conviction on display that they plump for a party that maybe doesn't necessarily represent all of their interests, but at least stands for something. And maybe sometimes the simplest way to get around that is to show some conviction.
Simply do the right thing as they saw it. Yeah.
I think if you have a look at where the polls were 2 weeks ago even, and where they are now, most of the movement has happened in that 2 weeks. Now, again, it's a mistake always to focus on one element that's caused that, but I don't think there's any doubt that one of the biggest movers was that decision 2 weeks ago for the Liberals to put the Greens last. One, it made them look more party of conviction, which is particularly important for Ted Baillieu, who's lacked that idea of conviction. And secondly, it wedged Labor, which has spent the previous 2 weeks saying, oh, you shouldn't have a deal with the Greens, they're awful. And then what was the one party left that was doing a deal with the Greens?
Yeah.
So I think
maybe
it really
you're right, Andrew. Maybe it was a good strategy after all.
I tell you what, this strategy will be noted by every Liberal state party around the country. I think it will be replicated. Labor will also respond. This could be the retreat from Moscow for the Greens, because they went into this thinking they could pick up 4 seats, maybe 19% of the vote. They got none, and about 10.5.
Do we accept then, George, that the Greens vote, and then perhaps this is one piece of good news for Julie Gillard and Federal Labor, as the Greens vote has peaked?
Well, to the extent that the Greens vote is 80% Labor and 20% Coalition, the Greens vote has peaked because the Coalition took back the 20 that was theirs by making this decision. I think we've all forgotten rather quickly that at the last federal election, only a couple of months ago, the swing to Labor in two-party preferred terms in Victoria was at the expense of Coalition voters that went to Greens and then to Labor on preferences. Labor's primary vote didn't pick up at the federal election. The Coalition primary vote fell, the Green primary vote went up, and it went back to Labor's preferences. So the survival instinct for the Liberal Party down here was to not let the Greens do the same thing to them at the state election that happened to them at the federal election. Yeah. Getting Green members in the inner city might be, a punch in the eye for the Labor Party, but doesn't actually help the Coalition in the suburbs. And they've worked this out at the death, and have won government for it.
OK, well, look, next is New South Wales and Queensland state elections, and the chances are that Labor will lose both of those, which means that by the end of next year, Julia Gillard will not only be dealing with the hung parliament at the federal level, but a majority of coalition premiers, including the whole of the eastern states. Have a look at the front page of the Telegraph in Sydney today, and Bernie Reardon, the party president, is... basically he's saying that he's confirmed that his own unions are open to supporting coalition candidates, which is not a good look. In yesterday's Courier Mail, there was an opinion poll that showed the coalition in front of Labor 60-40. Annabelle, trouble's ahead.
Yeah, sure. That's an extraordinary story about Bernie Reardon. And I think it probably gives you an idea of just how the New South Wales Labor government's chances are viewed even by quite senior members of the establishment. Last night, I think, I noticed on Twitter last night, Christina Keneally was at a sporting game and was sort of happily sending out updates of the scores. I suspect that that would have been a happier experience for her than watching what was happening in Victoria, because if this government can go down, then there's not much left of the New South Wales government.
I think there's been a
election.
remarkable rejuvenation of the Liberal brand. 2 years ago, the most senior Liberal in the country was the Lord Mayor of Brisbane. The Liberals did not hold government nationally. They did not hold government in any federal, any state or territory. The end was predicted for the party as a brand. Now we're seeing, I think within a year or a bit more, we will probably have, if the polls hold right, majority Liberal governments in the four most populous state. And also there's an outside chance, I would think that the Liberals would consider themselves a good chance in a new federal election too. It's been remarkable.
But is there an upside to that, though, George, on this, that if the checks and balances thing... Now, it didn't work for the Coalition when they talked about an all-red country, when Labor had so many state premiers, but... what do you think? Would that can that work for Julia Gillard at the next election?
Let's wind it back to 1996. In the first term of the Howard government between 1996 and 1998, there were 6 state and territory elections contested. Conservatives won 5 of the 6 of them. First term of the federal Labor government, Labor won 5 out of the 6. What happened after 98 was Labor went on a hot streak that we were talking about all the way through. You know, they've won another one, they've won another one. There were landslide victories in Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia and Queensland. John Howard kept winning federal elections, notwithstanding some very, very strong Labor wins at the state level. The debate in those days was whether the Liberal brand had been destroyed because Labor was rising in the states.
The
difficulty for Julia Gillard now is that so much of her agenda and what was done over the course of the Rudd government depends on this sort of COAG process of subscription from state governments. So not just the health agreement, which I think has kicked into pretty interesting territory if you've got a bailiu Victorian government. And let's face it, it's to Victoria that federal Labor has looked in the last few years for kind of being chopped up on these sorts of federal agreements, with the exception obviously of water, but water's ongoing. And then you've got the national curriculum. All of these programs that the states kind of need to sign up to, I think are going to be...
Right. Sorry, we have to move on, but I think what you're saying is policy just got a whole lot harder, and particularly health policy.